In the history of classical Hollywood, there has been no shortage of great stars. Those who conquered the screen through personal charisma, through dramatic intensity, or through radiant heroic images that audiences could recognize instantly at first glance. But within that brightly lit world of cinema, only a very small number of actors came to be seen as the embodiment of something quieter, the conscience of America. One of the clearest faces of that image was Henry Fonda. For many decades, Fonda almost always appeared on screen with the demeanor of an ordinary man. Not a flamboyant hero, not the kind of powerful character that Hollywood typically celebrated. He seemed more like a simple citizen, a man standing quietly in the middle of difficult circumstances, and through his calmness, making audiences believe that justice could still exist. That image became especially clear in films that would later enter the history of cinema. In The Grapes of Wrath, he played Tom Joad, a working man pushed to the edge of despair, but still holding on to faith in social justice. Many years later, in 12 Angry Men, he appeared as juror number 8, the only man in the room who did not rush to condemn a young boy. Not through anger, but through patience. Not through grand speeches, but through a single simple question. Are we certain? That was the acting style that defined the name Henry Fonda. Strength did not come from a loud voice. It came from calmness, from the ability to turn ordinary characters into a moral voice within a chaotic world. For many years, that image seemed almost inseparable from the man himself. But beyond the screen, the story was far more complicated. The people who understood Henry Fonda most clearly were not the audiences. They were his family. And his children, Jane Fonda and Peter Fonda, would later describe a father very different from the image the public had come to know. A private man, introspective, and at times almost unreachable on an emotional level. That contrast makes Henry Fonda's story particularly fascinating because it raises a rare question in the history of Hollywood. What happens when an actor becomes the moral symbol of an entire nation, while his private life is far more complicated than that image suggests? Sometimes art does not reflect who an actor truly is. Instead, it reflects what society wants to believe about itself. And through many decades of classical Hollywood, Henry Fonda became the face of that belief. Henry Fonda was born in 1905 in Grand Island, Nebraska, a small town in the American Midwest. It was not a place commonly associated with the worlds of cinema or theater. Yet that simple environment helped shape the man he would become. Fonda grew up in a stable middle-class family. His father ran a local printing shop, while his mother was involved in social and community activities. Life in Nebraska at the beginning of the 20th century moved at a slower pace, strongly influenced by Protestant ethics and the traditional values of the Midwest. There, qualities such as responsibility, discipline, and composure were considered the foundation of a mature person. At the time, no one could have known that these very ordinary values would later become the core of Henry Fonda's acting style. A style built not on dramatic intensity, but on the sincerity and calmness of an ordinary American. His path to acting also did not begin in the typical Hollywood way. Fonda did not grow up dreaming of becoming a star. For many years, he was simply a tall, rather shy young man who had not yet truly found a clear direction for his life. The opportunity came almost by chance when he was encouraged to participate in theater at the Omaha Community Playhouse. The person who pushed him onto the stage was Dorothy Brando, a local stage actress, and also the mother of Marlon Brando, who would later become one of the greatest icons of acting in the 20th century. On the small stage in Omaha, Henry Fonda began to discover an ability he himself had not previously recognized. He was not the flamboyant type of actor, but he possessed something else, an authentic presence. Audiences believed in the characters he portrayed. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Fonda left Nebraska and moved to New York City, where the Broadway stage was the center of American performing arts. There, he worked with several theater companies and gradually accumulated stage experience. This path was neither fast nor easy, but each small role helped him build a reputation as a serious and reliable actor. By the early 1930s, Henry Fonda had become a notable presence on the Broadway stage. And from there, Hollywood began to take notice of him. After gaining attention on the Broadway stage, Henry Fonda began entering Hollywood in the mid-1930s, a period when the American film studio system was at the height of its power. Unlike many young actors who arrived in Hollywood with glamorous images, Fonda appeared with an entirely different demeanor. He was tall, thin, with a serious face, and he almost never tried to create excessive drama in his acting. His voice was deep and clear, carrying the distinctive tone of the American Midwest. While this made him stand out in a very particular way. While many male Hollywood stars at the time were built up as elegant gentlemen or heroes larger than life, Henry Fonda brought the feeling of someone familiar, a neighbor, an ordinary citizen, a man the audience could trust. His first notable film role came with The Farmer Takes a Wife, adapted from the very Broadway play in which he had performed. The film was not a revolutionary work, but it helped Hollywood recognize that Fonda possessed a rare quality: the ability to make simple characters feel convincing. From there, he quickly became a familiar face in Hollywood during the latter half of the 1930s. Fonda appeared in many different films, from drama to westerns, gradually building a reputation as a reliable and thoughtful actor. During this period, he began collaborating with several important directors of classical Hollywood. Most notably John Ford, who would later help shape some of the most important roles of Fonda's career. Ford was famous for his iconic films about American history and society, and Fonda's understated acting style fit perfectly within the cinematic world he created. In addition, Fonda also worked with William Wyler, another director known for films rich in psychological and moral depth. These filmmakers did not look to Fonda for explosive emotional displays. Instead, they found something else in him: authenticity. The films in the early stage of Henry Fonda's career often revolved around stories that felt deeply American. Stories about ordinary people facing moral choices, about justice, civic responsibility, and the belief that an individual could still make a difference. It was in roles like these that the image of Henry Fonda gradually took shape. He was not the classic Hollywood hero. He did not triumph through strength or charm. He triumphed through integrity. By the end of the 1930s, these audiences began to see in Henry Fonda a very distinctive kind of character in American cinema: the calm man who stands up for what is right, even when no one else does. and that image would reach its peak in a film released in 1940. A film that not only changed his career, but also became one of the most important works in the history of Hollywood. The true turning point in Henry Fonda's career came in 1940 with the film The Grapes of Wrath, directed by John Ford and adapted from the famous novel by John Steinbeck. The film tells the story of the Joad family, Oklahoma farmers, who are forced to leave their homeland during the Great Depression in search of a new life in California. In the role of Tom Joad, Henry Fonda did not simply play a film character. He became the voice of an entire class of Americans being pushed to the margins of society. Tom Joad is not a traditional hero. He is a man who has made mistakes, recently released from prison, trying to find his place again in a world that is rapidly changing. Yet scene after scene, Fonda brought a calm determination that made the character extraordinary. Not through grand speeches, but through very simple moments. A look, a tone of voice, a silence. One of the film's most famous lines, when Tom Joad speaks about always being present wherever injustice exists, became one of the most iconic speeches in American cinema. The role earned Henry Fonda an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, and more importantly, it confirmed the image that Hollywood had begun to associate with him: the face of integrity. Many years later, that image would be reinforced in another film that would become a classic of American cinema: 12 Angry Men. In this film, Henry Fonda plays juror number 8, the only member of the jury room who refuses to immediately convict a young man accused of killing his father. The other 11 men have almost already made up their minds. They want to finish quickly and return to their own lives. But juror number 8 is not certain. What makes the character remarkable is that he is not an orator. He does not shout. He does not impose his opinion on others. He simply does one very simple thing. He asks a question. Are we certain? Step by step, through patience and reason, he forces the entire room to reconsider their prejudices and assumptions. Henry Fonda does not play the role with dramatic intensity. He plays it with calmness, a kind of strength that is very rare in cinema. What few people know is that Fonda was not only the lead actor in the film, he was also the producer of the project, because he believed the story deserved to be told. With 12 Angry Men, Henry Fonda's on-screen image was almost fully realized. Not a hero larger than life, but an ordinary man willing to stand up for what is right, even when he is the only one in the room willing to do so. And it was precisely that image that made Henry Fonda one of the most distinctive moral symbols in the history of Hollywood. In the early 1940s, when Henry Fonda's career was gaining strong momentum following the success of The Grapes of Wrath, the United States entered World War II. Many Hollywood actors participated in propaganda efforts or performed for the troops, but Fonda chose a different path. In 1942, he volunteered to join the United States Navy. The decision came from a very clear conviction. Fonda once said that he did not want to play soldiers on screen while other men were actually fighting on the battlefield. He trained at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station and later served aboard destroyers operating in the Pacific. During more than 3 years of service, Fonda took part in numerous patrol and fleet protection missions. He reached the rank of lieutenant junior grade, and after the war was awarded the Bronze Star for his service. This period almost completely separated him from the world of cinema. Yet for many Americans at the time, it also made Henry Fonda's real-life image resemble the characters he often portrayed on screen, an ordinary citizen willing to fulfill his duty. After the war ended in 1945, Fonda returned to his acting career. But instead of immediately returning to Hollywood, he spent much of his time on the stage. For Fonda, theater had always been the place where acting felt the most direct and authentic. One of his greatest successes during this period was the play Mr. Roberts, in which he played a naval officer aboard a supply ship during World War II. The role quickly became one of Fonda's most famous stage performances. He performed the play hundreds of times on Broadway and later during tours across the United States. And the character of Mr. Roberts, an officer trying to maintain his integrity within the pressures of military life, once again reflected the type of role Fonda portrayed so naturally: ordinary people trying to do the right thing. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, his career continued to develop. The films of the post-war period helped Fonda solidify his position as one of the most serious actors in the film industry. By the late 1950s, with films such as 12 Angry Men, Henry Fonda was no longer simply a movie star. He had become one of the most respected actors of his generation. His reputation did not come from the glamour of Hollywood. It came from something that both audiences and directors recognized in him: a rare authenticity on screen. While on screen, Henry Fonda often represented the conscience and integrity of America. His private life was far more complicated and filled with contradictions. Throughout his life, Fonda married 5 times. His marriages stretched across many decades of classical Hollywood. Yet his family life was rarely stable for long. Perhaps the most significant marriage of his life was with Frances Ford Seymour, a woman from a wealthy family with a position in New York society. The two married in 1936 and had 2 children together, Jane Fonda and Peter Fonda. But this marriage also ended in one of the greatest tragedies of the family. In 1950, while being treated at a psychiatric hospital in New York, Frances Ford Seymour died after taking her own life. At the time, Jane was about 12 years old and Peter about 10. The event became a haunting memory for Henry Fonda's children for the rest of their lives. What made the story even more complicated was the way the family handled the event. For many years, Jane Fonda said that she was not told clearly about the cause of her mother's death. Instead, she was simply told that her mother had died of a heart attack. Only many years later, after reading a newspaper article, did Jane learn the truth. The emotional distance between father and children also became a subject Jane Fonda mentioned many times in later interviews. She often described her father as a very private man, someone who almost never spoke about personal emotions. He could be polite, calm, and extremely self-controlled, qualities that made him an exceptional actor. But those same qualities also made him difficult to approach in family life. Jane Fonda once said that throughout her youth, she always felt as if she was trying to earn her father's approval. He rarely expressed pride or affection in a direct way. Meanwhile, Peter Fonda also had a complicated relationship with his father. Peter later became one of the symbolic figures of the counterculture of the 1960s, famous for the film Easy Rider. The path he chose was very far from the quiet and traditional image of his father. These stories do not diminish the artistic stature of Henry Fonda, but they reveal another side of the man, a deeply introspective individual who sometimes kept distance even from those closest to him. And it is here that a particular paradox appears in his life. On screen, Henry Fonda often played characters who could see what was right and stand up to defend it. But in his private life, he remained a reserved and difficult man to understand, even to his own family. That was the distance between the public image and the real person. A distance not uncommon in the history of Hollywood, but rarely as visible as in the story of Henry Fonda. After many decades associated with the image of Hollywood's man of integrity, Henry Fonda unexpectedly appeared in a completely different role in 1968. The film was Once Upon a Time in the West, an epic Western directed by Italian filmmaker Sergio Leone. For American audiences at the time, Henry Fonda's appearance in this film was almost a shock. Throughout his career, Fonda had often played characters who represented conscience and justice. But in Once Upon a Time in the West, he portrayed Frank, a ruthless killer working for a railroad company. From his very first appearance on screen, Leone deliberately shattered Fonda's familiar image. In one haunting scene, Frank coldly shoots a child. That moment almost completely reversed everything audiences had come to believe about Henry Fonda. Leone later explained that he intentionally chose Fonda for the villain precisely for that reason. Audiences were used to seeing him as a symbol of morality. When that same face committed a cruel act, the cinematic effect became far more powerful. The role of Frank quickly became one of the most memorable villains in the history of spaghetti westerns. For Henry Fonda, it was also a way of renewing his image in the later stage of his career. He proved that he was not only the moral symbol of classical Hollywood, but also an actor willing to break the very image that had defined him. During the 1970s and the early 1980s, Fonda continued to appear in many major films. But the most memorable moment of the final phase of his life came in 1981 with the film On Golden Pond. In this film, Henry Fonda played Norman Thayer, an aging man, sometimes irritable, confronting old age and the fragility of life. What made the film especially remarkable was that he acted alongside his daughter, Jane Fonda. For many audiences, the film carried a deeply personal meaning. The relationship between the father and daughter characters in the story partly reflected the emotional distance that had once existed in real life between Henry Fonda and Jane Fonda. The role of Norman Thayer earned Henry Fonda the Academy Award for Best Actor, the only Oscar of his entire film career. At the age of 76, after more than 4 decades on screen, Henry Fonda finally received Hollywood's highest recognition. It was a late peak, but also a very fitting conclusion to the career of one of the most respected actors in the history of American cinema. In the history of Hollywood, Henry Fonda was never the kind of glamorous star. He was not famous for action hero roles, nor was he an actor known for frequent explosions of emotion on screen. His style was always simpler than that. Fonda built his career by portraying ordinary people, farmers, citizens, jurors, individuals standing before difficult moral choices. In those roles, he brought something very rare to cinema, a calmness that carried moral weight. His characters did not try to persuade audiences through strength or dramatic intensity. They persuaded through authenticity. For that reason, over many decades, Henry Fonda gradually became a very particular symbol in American cinema. Not a symbol of power, but a symbol of conscience. Films such as The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men are still remembered as representative works of the idea that an ordinary individual can still stand up for what is right. Henry Fonda's influence can be seen in many generations of actors who followed. Artists who chose an understated, natural style of performance and focused on the moral depth of their characters. His legacy also continued within his own family. His daughter, Jane Fonda, became one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood, winning 2 Academy Awards, while also becoming a highly influential figure in American cultural and political life. Meanwhile, his son, Peter Fonda, became the symbol of a completely different generation. With the film Easy Rider, Peter Fonda became one of the defining faces of the countercultural cinema movement of the late 1960s. 2 very different paths, but both reveal one thing. The legacy of Henry Fonda does not exist only in the films he left behind. It continues to live through the generations of actors and filmmakers who came after him. A legacy that is not loud, but enduring. Much like the man himself, Henry Fonda's life always contained an intriguing paradox. On screen, he almost became the symbol of morality and justice in American cinema. The characters he portrayed, from The Grapes of Wrath to 12 Angry Men, were often ordinary people willing to stand up for what was right, even when they had to stand alone. But in real life, Henry Fonda was a private, complex man, sometimes difficult to approach even for those closest to him. Perhaps it is that very contrast that makes his story so memorable. Because in art, an actor does not always reflect who he truly is. Sometimes, he reflects what society wants to believe about itself. And through many decades of classical Hollywood, Henry Fonda became the face of that belief. The belief that in a world full of conflict, there is still room for calmness, reason, and conscience. If you enjoy real stories behind the icons of Hollywood and music, follow Icons and Legacies to continue exploring journeys like this. Because behind every legend, there is always a story that few people truly know.